All right, this is Block 8, Pax Americana, Section 2, the beginning of the Cold War, with the section, the section Nuclear Weapons. Nuclear weapons. The American nuclear monopoly only lasted for 4 years. In 1949, the Soviets, with a little bit of help from Western spies, exploded their first atomic bomb. This was a huge shock. 1949 was kind of the year of shocks in the United States in terms of the Cold War. First, the Chinese Civil War ended with a communist victory. The Soviets exploded their own nuclear bomb, and this sort of thing shocked the Americans, who believed that this sort of stuff was not going to happen in the world. But now both superpowers, both the United States and the Soviet Union, controlled these controlled nuclear weapons. The power of which was unlike anything that had ever been seen before on a battlefield, that one bomb now had the possibility and the potential to destroy an entire city. The Soviets suggested that the United Nations control all nuclear weapons, that everyone would give up their nuclear bombs and give them over to UN control. The United States and France, Great Britain, and China vetoed that proposal for 2 reasons. And this is very important to remember. A lot of the things that we're going to look at in the Cold War have to do with nuclear weapons, their reduction, their treaties, etc., etc., etc. And in order to do that, we need to understand the difference between conventional forces and nuclear forces. Okay? The reason why the Soviets are always willing to cut the number of weapons and accuse the United States of not being willing to cut the number of nuclear weapons is because of the fact that the Soviets had a much larger conventional army. Now, there's 2 types of forces. There's nuclear forces. We understand what that is. That's bombers, submarines, missiles that carry and use nuclear weapons to attack, destroy, defend an enemy. Conventional forces are non-nuclear forces. Conventional forces are what we think of when we think of armies. Troops, tanks, planes, men, artillery. That's conventional forces. Conventional means regular. Nuclear weapons were the new thing. Conventional things were regular forces. The Soviets always had a much larger conventional army. For every tank that the United States and the Western Allies had in Europe, the Soviets had 10. For every division of troops that the United States and the Western Allies had in Europe, the Soviets had 10. So it was in the Soviets' interest to have fewer nuclear weapons, because that meant that their conventional forces would have been able to overwhelm the Western powers. The United States is always unwilling to give up its nuclear weapons, because that is the only thing that allows the United States to keep the conventional forces low. That needs to make sense, the difference between nuclear weapons and conventional weapons. The nuclear weapons in Europe are an equalizer, that the Soviets have a much larger army, a much larger conventional army, and nuclear weapons are needed to kind of make up the difference. That was the first reason the Soviets argued for UN control of nuclear weapons. That they had a much larger conventional field army, and they would be at an advantage the fewer nuclear weapons there were. And the other thing was, they knew that American scientists could produce more efficient, bigger, better nuclear bombs faster than they could. So there was a degree of recognition of a scientific and industrial inferiority. But regardless of that inferiority, after 1949, an arms race comes into being that is going to last for the next decade and a half. Each side trying to build bigger, more powerful, or excuse me, not bigger, let's say it this way. Each side trying to build more powerful nuclear bombs that can fit on ever smaller payloads. They're trying to make the bombs smaller and more powerful at the same time. That at the beginning, the first atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima had to be carried. It was an especially modified B-29 bomber. It was the only thing that could fit in the bomb bay. It weighed, 40,000 pounds. It was a big, hefty bomb. And it was relatively weak as far as nuclear weapons go. As time goes on, the technology gets better, the bombs get smaller. First, you can fit several in a bomber. Then you can start to fit them to the tips of missiles. And today, you can fit a nuclear bomb in a suitcase. And they got more powerful. And they got especially more powerful in the early 1950s with the advent of what are known as thermonuclear weapons. Atomic bombs, what we think of when we think of World War II, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, an atomic bomb uses the power of atomic fission. Neutrons are fired at atoms and they are split apart, and in the splitting apart, they release enormous amounts of energy. A thermonuclear weapon is a fusion bomb. Basically what you do is inside the bomb, you blow up an atomic bomb. And then the heat and pressure of that atomic bomb inside the other bomb cause hydrogen atoms to fuse, releasing massive amounts of energy, much more powerful than a regular atomic bomb. This is the power of the sun. This is how the sun creates energy. One single thermonuclear bomb is 1,000 times more powerful than a Hiroshima nuclear bomb. And by the early 1950s, both sides, the Americans and the Soviets, were in this race to create thermonuclear weapons and then more powerful thermonuclear weapons, etc., etc. Many concerned scientists began voicing concerns that these bombs were getting too big, too powerful, that for the first time in human history we had the ability literally to destroy civilization, and this was true. Men like Robert Oppenheimer, men like Albert Einstein argued that such weapons should not be created. But the Cold War demanded that they be built, that if we weren't going to build them, the Soviets would. And the Soviets, if they had them and we didn't, we would be at a fundamental disadvantage. And the argument works vice versa, that the Soviets have to build them because if they don't, the Americans will, and then the Soviets will be at a disadvantage. The reality of possible destruction of civilization in a matter of hours played a huge role in the culture of the 1950s, which we're going to talk about later. But that's, nuclear weapons are a game changer on the battlefield and in the realm of politics and diplomacy. And the arms race of the 1950s is one of the defining things of that decade.